Hi guys. Have you ever wondered what people did for fun in medieval times when life was brutal, short, and filled with back-breaking labor? Well, they found ways to escape reality, just like people do today. But the substances they used, the rituals surrounding them, and the consequences they faced were wildly different from anything we know in the modern world. Tonight, we're going on a journey through the hazy, intoxicating world of medieval Europe, where getting high wasn't just about recreation. It was woven into medicine, religion, social gatherings, and even warfare. From monks brewing beer in monasteries to witches accused of flying on broomsticks coated with hallucinogenic ointments, the medieval relationship with mind-altering substances was complex, fascinating, and sometimes downright dangerous. We'll explore the ales and wines that flowed freely in taverns, the opium that dulled surgical pain, the strange herbs that promised visions and healing, and the social structures that both encouraged and punished intoxication. So settle in as we peel back the centuries and discover what getting high was really like when knights roamed the countryside and plague lurked around every corner. Okay, friends, before you settle in, if you enjoy this kind of deep dive content, then click the like button and don't forget to subscribe. And yes, leave a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now, dim the lights and turn on the fan, and let's dive into tonight's journey together. The medieval period, spanning roughly from the 5th century to the 15th century, was a time of dramatic contrasts. While we often picture knights in shining armor and grand castles, the reality for most people was far grittier. Life expectancy hovered around 30 to 40 years, infant mortality was staggeringly high, and disease could wipe out entire villages in a matter of weeks. Work was physically demanding, whether you toiled in the fields as a peasant or served in a lord's household. Winters were harsh, food was often scarce, and entertainment options were limited. In this challenging environment, people sought relief and escape wherever they could find it, and mind-altering substances played a surprisingly central role in daily life. Unlike today, where we have a clear distinction between legal and illegal substances, medieval people operated in a world where the line between medicine, recreation, and spirituality was often blurred beyond recognition. Alcohol was by far the most common and socially accepted intoxicant in medieval Europe. In fact, it wasn't just accepted, it was practically mandatory. Clean water was difficult to come by in medieval towns and cities, where sanitation was poor and waterborne diseases were common. The process of brewing beer or fermenting wine killed harmful bacteria, making these beverages safer to drink than water. As a result, people of all ages, including children, consumed alcohol daily. But this wasn't the occasional glass of wine with dinner that we might think of today. Medieval people drank throughout the day, starting with a weak ale at breakfast and continuing with stronger beverages as the day progressed. The alcohol content varied widely, but even the weakest small beer contained enough alcohol to produce mild intoxication if consumed in sufficient quantities, which people regularly did. Beer was the drink of choice in Northern Europe, particularly in England, Germany, and the Low Countries. Monasteries became centers of brewing expertise, with monks perfecting recipes that would be passed down through generations. These religious men weren't drinking for purely spiritual reasons. They were businessmen too, selling their surplus beer to fund their monasteries. The process of medieval brewing was quite different from modern methods. Hops, which give beer its characteristic bitter flavor and act as a preservative, weren't widely used until the later medieval period. Instead, brewers used a mixture of herbs and spices called grut, which could include bog myrtle, yarrow, wild rosemary, and other plants. Some of these herbs had mild psychoactive properties beyond the alcohol itself, adding an extra dimension to the drinking experience. The result was a beverage that was often cloudy, thick, and quite different in taste from modern beer, but no less intoxicating. The brewing process itself was labor-intensive and required considerable skill. Grain, usually barley, but sometimes wheat or oats, had to be malted first. This involved soaking the grain in water until it began to sprout, then drying it in a kiln to stop the germination process. The malting converted the starches in the grain into sugars that yeast could ferment. The malted grain was then crushed and mixed with hot water in a large vessel called a mash tun, where it would steep for several hours. The liquid that resulted, called wort, was drained off and boiled with the grut mixture. After cooling, yeast was added, though medieval brewers didn't understand that yeast was a living organism. They thought fermentation was a spontaneous, almost magical process. The beer would ferment for several days to several weeks, depending on the desired strength and the ambient temperature. Different regions developed their own distinctive brewing traditions. In England, ale was the term for beer made without hops, while beer specifically referred to the hopped variety that became popular in the 15th century. The introduction of hops was actually controversial, with some people considering hopped beer to be a foreign adulterant that corrupted good English ale. In Germany, brewing was often a communal activity, with villages maintaining shared brew houses where families would take turns producing their household supply. The beer produced in these settings varied wildly in quality and strength, with some batches turning out thin and sour, while others were rich and potent. In Belgium and the Low Countries, certain monasteries became renowned for producing exceptionally strong beers, some of which could reach alcohol contents rivaling modern wines. The strength of medieval beer varied considerably. Small beer, which was consumed daily by everyone including children, might have an alcohol content of only 1 to 3%. This was weak enough that it wouldn't cause significant intoxication when consumed in moderate amounts, though medieval portions were rarely moderate by modern standards. A laborer might drink several liters of small beer throughout a working day without becoming noticeably drunk. However, stronger ales and beers were also produced, with alcohol contents ranging from 5 to 10% or even higher for special brews. These stronger beverages were reserved for evening consumption, festivals, and celebrations, when getting thoroughly intoxicated was not only acceptable but expected. The taste of medieval beer was quite different from what modern drinkers would expect. Without refrigeration or modern quality control, beer could spoil quickly, developing sour or off flavors. The grut spices gave the beer unusual flavors that might include bitter, sweet, herbal, and even slightly hallucinogenic notes depending on the herbs used. Some of the plants commonly included in grut, such as yarrow and bog myrtle, contain compounds that can produce mild euphoria or drowsiness beyond what alcohol alone would cause. This meant that drinking medieval beer wasn't quite the same experience as drinking modern beer. There was an additional layer of psychoactive effect that enhanced the intoxication. Whether brewers deliberately sought out these effects or simply noticed that certain herb combinations produced particularly popular beers is unclear, but the tradition persisted for centuries. Wine was more prestigious than beer and was particularly popular in southern Europe, where grapes grew readily. The Mediterranean climate of France, Italy, and Spain made these regions ideal for viticulture, and wine became deeply embedded in the culture. Unlike beer, which was associated with commoners and peasants, wine carried an air of sophistication and wealth. The wealthy could afford aged wines imported from distant regions, while the poor drank whatever local vintage they could afford, which was often sour and barely palatable. Monasteries also produced wine, particularly in France, and monks became renowned for their winemaking skills. The Church's need for wine in the sacrament of communion ensured that viticulture remained important even during times of social upheaval. Drinking wine wasn't just about getting intoxicated. It was woven into religious ritual, with Christ's blood symbolically represented by wine in the Eucharist. The production of wine in medieval times was both an art and a science, though the science was poorly understood. Grapes were harvested in late summer or early autumn, and the timing of the harvest was critical. Too early, and the grapes wouldn't have developed enough sugar to ferment into a strong wine. Too late, and they might rot on the vine or be damaged by early frost. Once harvested, the grapes were crushed, traditionally by foot, to release the juice. The crushed grapes, called must, were left to ferment in large wooden barrels or stone vats. The skins of red grapes were left in contact with the juice during fermentation, giving red wine its color and tannins, while white wine was made by removing the skins before fermentation. The fermentation process was unpredictable, dependent on wild yeasts present on the grape skins and in the environment. Medieval winemakers had no control over which yeast strains were fermenting their wine, and they had no way to regulate temperature precisely. This meant that every batch of wine was unique, and some batches inevitably failed, turning into vinegar or developing unpleasant flavors. Successful wines were precious, and the best vintages were carefully stored and aged. The wealthy developed sophisticated palates and could distinguish between wines from different regions and years. Wine from Bordeaux, Burgundy, and the Rhine Valley became particularly prized, and these regions developed reputations that persist to this day. The trade in fine wines created wealthy merchant families and drove economic development in wine-producing regions. For the common people, wine was often mixed with water to make it go further and to reduce its intoxicating effects slightly. Pasca, a mixture of wine and water that had been popular in Roman times, continued to be consumed throughout the medieval period. The poor also drank piquette, which was made by adding water to the pomace, the leftover grape skins and seeds from winemaking, and allowing it to ferment briefly. This produced a weak, sour beverage that was better than nothing, but far inferior to real wine. Some desperate people even made wine from fruits other than grapes, including apples, pears, berries, and even parsnips, though these fruit wines were generally considered inferior and were drunk only when grape wine was unavailable or unaffordable. The social rituals surrounding wine consumption were elaborate, especially among the nobility. Formal dinners and banquets featured multiple courses, each accompanied by appropriate wines. The ability to serve rare and expensive wines demonstrated wealth and status, and hosts competed to outdo each other with increasingly extravagant displays. Wine was served in decorative cups and goblets made of precious metals or fine glass, and the vessels themselves became symbols of prestige. The ritual of toasting, where drinkers would raise their cups to honor someone or celebrate an occasion, was already well established in medieval times. These toasts could become quite lengthy, with multiple rounds of drinking that left participants thoroughly intoxicated by the end of the evening. Spiced and sweetened wines were particularly popular among those who could afford them. Hippocras, named after the ancient Greek physician Hippocrates, was wine infused with spices such as cinnamon, ginger, cloves, and nutmeg, then sweetened with honey or sugar. Sugar was extremely expensive in medieval Europe, having to be imported from the Middle East or North Africa, so Hippocras was a luxury reserved for the wealthy. The spices not only improved the flavor of wine that might have been starting to turn, but also added their own mild psychoactive effects. Many of the spices used had warming, stimulating properties that complemented the depressant effects of alcohol, creating a complex and pleasant intoxication. Mulled wine, heated with spices and honey, was popular in winter, providing both warmth and intoxication to ward off the cold. Taverns and alehouses were the social centers of medieval towns and villages. These establishments were far more than just places to drink. They were where news was exchanged, business deals were struck, and communities came together. The atmosphere in a medieval tavern was rowdy and boisterous, with drinking games, gambling, and singing common pastimes. People from all walks of life rubbed shoulders in these establishments, though the very poor often couldn't afford even the cheapest ale. Tavern keepers were usually women, known as alewives, who brewed beer in their homes and sold it to customers. These women occupied a unique position in medieval society, wielding economic power through their brewing skills. However, they also faced suspicion and moral judgment, particularly from the church, which associated taverns with sin and debauchery. The physical space of a medieval tavern was quite different from a modern bar. Most taverns were simply the front room of someone's house, with a few benches or stools and perhaps some rough tables. The ale was stored in barrels in an adjoining room or cellar, and customers would be served directly from these barrels into wooden or ceramic mugs. There was no bar in the modern sense, no elaborate display of bottles, no professional bartenders mixing cocktails. Instead, the alewife or her family members would move among the customers, refilling mugs and collecting payment. The ale was served at room temperature, which in medieval buildings meant it was often quite cool in winter and uncomfortably warm in summer. There was no ice to chill beverages, so people simply drank whatever temperature the ale happened to be. Lighting in taverns came from candles, oil lamps, or the fireplace, creating a dim, smoky atmosphere. The smoke came not just from the fire, but also from the customers themselves, as many people smoked pipes filled with various herbs, though tobacco wouldn't arrive in Europe until after the medieval period. The herbs smoked might include coltsfoot, mugwort, or other plants that were believed to have medicinal properties, or simply provided a pleasant sensation. The combination of smoke, body heat, spilled ale, and unwashed humanity created a distinctive smell that would be overwhelming to modern sensibilities, but was simply normal to medieval people. Entertainment in taverns was participatory rather than passive. People sang songs together, often bawdy or satirical ones that mocked the nobility, the clergy, or unpopular neighbors.
Storytellers would recount tales of adventure, romance, or local history, their narratives becoming more elaborate and less accurate as the ale flowed. Gambling was ubiquitous, with games of dice being particularly popular. These games could be simple affairs where players bet on the roll of the dice, or more complex games with elaborate rules. Cheating was common, and disputes over gambling debts often led to fights. The authorities periodically tried to crack down on gambling in taverns, but enforcement was sporadic and largely ineffective. Prostitution was also closely associated with tavern culture. Some women in ancient times earned a living through work connected to taverns, and in certain cases, innkeepers or ale sellers gained extra income by arranging such activities. The Church condemned prostitution as sinful, but secular authorities took a more pragmatic view, often tolerating or even regulating the sex trade. In some cities, brothels were licensed and operated under official oversight, with the workers required to undergo periodic health inspections and to confine their activities to designated areas. The association between alcohol, loosened inhibitions, and sexual activity was well understood, and taverns served as informal meeting places where such transactions could be negotiated. The legal status of taverns varied across medieval Europe. In England, alehouses were required to be licensed by local authorities, and alewives who brewed without permission could be fined. The quality of ale was also regulated, at least in theory, with officials called ale tasters, appointed to ensure that brewers weren't watering down their product or charging excessive prices. In practice, enforcement was uneven, and many alewives operated without proper licenses, brewing and selling ale whenever they had surplus grain. The authorities generally turned a blind eye as long as the ale was of acceptable quality and no one complained too loudly. In times of grain shortage, however, brewing might be restricted or banned entirely to ensure that grain was reserved for food rather than alcohol. The social dynamics within taverns reflected the hierarchies of medieval society, but with some interesting inversions. While nobles and peasants might not socialize much outside the tavern, within its walls they might find themselves drinking side by side, united by their common desire for intoxication. Of course, the noble would drink finer wine while the peasant made do with cheap ale, but the shared space created opportunities for interaction that wouldn't exist in more formal settings. Taverns were places where news from the wider world filtered down to common people, where political gossip was exchanged, and where popular opinion was formed. They were, in a sense, the social media of the medieval world, where information spread and reputations were made or destroyed. Drunkenness was extremely common in medieval times, and social attitudes toward it were complicated. On one hand, moderate drinking was seen as normal and even healthy. Medical theories of the time, based on the ancient Greek concept of the four humors, held that wine and beer could balance the body's internal fluids and promote health. On the other hand, excessive drunkenness was condemned as a sin, particularly by church authorities who railed against the moral dangers of intoxication. Drunkards were portrayed in sermons and moral tales as foolish, violent, and lecherous. Despite this condemnation, enforcement of sobriety was lax, and drunken behavior was tolerated to a degree that would shock modern sensibilities. Public drunkenness was common, and while it might earn you a night in the stocks or a fine, it rarely resulted in serious punishment unless it led to violence or property damage. The spectacle of public drunkenness was so common that it became a regular feature of medieval life.
Stumbling home from the tavern late at night, singing loudly and disturbing the neighbors was a routine occurrence. In cities, the night watch would encounter drunk people regularly, and unless they were causing serious trouble, they would simply be sent on their way or helped home. The stocks, where minor offenders would be locked in place and subjected to public ridicule, often featured a steady stream of drunkards who had crossed some line of acceptable behavior. Passers-by would mock them, throw rotten vegetables, or offer unwanted advice about the evils of drink, but the punishment was meant to be humiliating rather than truly harsh. Different cultures within medieval Europe had varying attitudes toward drunkenness. In Germanic cultures, heavy drinking was associated with masculinity and warrior culture. The ability to drink large quantities and still function was seen as admirable, and social gatherings often turned into informal drinking contests where men would compete to prove their capacity for alcohol. In Mediterranean cultures, while wine consumption was universal, there was somewhat more emphasis on moderation and the civilized enjoyment of drink. Getting falling down drunk was considered boorish and lacking in self-control, though this didn't prevent it from happening with regularity. The contrast reflected deeper cultural differences in how these societies viewed self-control, honor, and social behavior. Gender also played a significant role in attitudes toward drunkenness. Men were generally given more latitude to drink heavily and behave badly while intoxicated. A drunk man might be seen as foolish or sinful, but his drunkenness was often excused or treated as a temporary lapse. Women, on the other hand, faced much harsher judgment. A drunk woman was seen as violating fundamental expectations of female virtue and self-control. She risked her reputation and might be accused of sexual impropriety, since intoxication and loose morals were closely linked in the medieval mind. Alewives walked a delicate line, their profession requiring them to be around alcohol and drunk people constantly, yet their respectability depending on maintaining proper behavior themselves. Many alewives were widows or unmarried women who had few other options for supporting themselves, and they had to navigate complex social expectations while running their businesses. The relationship between drink and violence was well recognized in medieval society. Tavern brawls were common, with disputes over gambling, perceived insults, or simple drunken aggression often escalating into fistfights or knife fights. Medieval people carried weapons as a matter of course. A peasant might have a knife for eating and work, while wealthier men wore swords, and alcohol-fueled arguments could quickly turn deadly. Some cities tried to reduce violence by requiring people to leave their weapons at home when going to taverns, but enforcement was difficult, and people often ignored such regulations. The combination of honor culture, where insults demanded response, and widespread intoxication created a volatile mix that resulted in numerous deaths and injuries. Domestic violence was also associated with drunkenness, though the sources are less clear about this aspect of medieval life. Court records and moral literature suggest that drunk husbands beating their wives was common enough to be remarked upon, and religious authorities condemned such behavior, while also emphasizing wives' duty to submit to their husbands. The legal system offered little protection to women in these situations, and neighbors who might intervene if a beating seemed excessive were otherwise expected to stay out of family matters. The power dynamics of medieval marriage, combined with the high rates of alcohol consumption and the social acceptance of male aggression, created conditions where domestic abuse flourished. The economic burden of excessive drinking was also recognized, particularly when it threatened family survival. A man who spent his wages on drink rather than food for his family was condemned, and wives of such men might appeal to local authorities or the church for help. In some cases, a husband could be forbidden from entering taverns or have his access to money restricted. However, these interventions were rare and required the situation to become quite dire before authorities would step in. The general attitude was that a man's drinking was his own business, unless it created a public problem or left his family destitute and dependent on charity. Beyond alcohol, medieval people had access to a variety of other mind-altering substances, though many of these were understood primarily through the lens of medicine rather than recreation. Opium was known throughout the medieval period, having been used in the ancient world and continuing to be valued for its pain-relieving properties. It came primarily from the Middle East and Asia, arriving in Europe through trade routes. Opium poppies were also grown in some parts of Europe, particularly in monastery gardens where monks cultivated medicinal herbs. The milky sap extracted from poppy seed pods was incredibly potent, and medieval physicians used it to treat everything from headaches to the agonizing pain of surgery. There were no anesthetics as we know them today, so opium was one of the few ways to make medical procedures bearable. The knowledge of opium's properties stretched back thousands of years, with ancient Egyptian, Greek, and Roman physicians all documenting its uses. Medieval European medical knowledge was heavily influenced by these ancient texts, supplemented by Arabic medical writings that preserved and expanded on classical learning. Islamic physicians like Avicenna wrote extensively about opium, describing its effects, appropriate dosages, and the dangers of excessive use. These texts were translated into Latin and became standard references in medieval European medicine. The sophistication of Arabic pharmacy meant that various preparations of opium were available, from crude raw opium to refined tinctures dissolved in wine or other liquids. The trade routes that brought opium to Europe were complex and often dangerous. Merchants traveling the Silk Road carried opium along with spices, silk, and other luxury goods, facing bandits, harsh weather, and political instability. The price of opium reflected these difficulties, making it expensive and limiting its availability. In port cities like Venice and Genoa, which served as gateways between East and West, opium was more readily available and somewhat cheaper than in inland areas. Apothecaries in these cities stocked opium as a standard medicine, while physicians in more remote areas might have limited access and would reserve it for only the most serious cases. The experience of taking opium in medieval times would have been profoundly different from modern opioid use. For one thing, dosage was imprecise and unpredictable. There was no standardization, no quality control, no accurate way to measure the concentration of active compounds in a given sample. A physician would estimate the dose based on experience and the patient's condition, but the same amount of opium could have vastly different effects depending on how it was prepared and how potent the raw material was. This meant that accidental overdoses were not uncommon, and patients might slip from pain relief into unconsciousness or even death without warning. The context in which opium was administered also shaped the experience. A patient about to undergo surgery without any real understanding of what was happening, in terrible pain, frightened and possibly delirious from fever or infection, would experience opium's effects through the lens of that trauma. The drug might bring blessed relief from pain and terror, creating a sense of floating detachment from the body, or it might intensify confusion and fear. Medieval people had no concept of set and setting in the modern sense, but they understood intuitively that the circumstances of taking powerful medicines mattered. Physicians would often try to calm and reassure patients before administering opium, recognizing that a more settled mental state led to better outcomes. Opium was also used for conditions we wouldn't treat with opioids today. Coughs, diarrhea, and insomnia were all indications for opium, and some physicians prescribed it for melancholy or other mental disturbances. The broad application of opium reflects both the limited options available to medieval medicine and the drug's genuine effectiveness at suppressing symptoms, even if it did nothing to cure the underlying condition. A merchant suffering from dysentery might take opium daily for weeks, becoming physically dependent without realizing it. When the illness finally resolved and the opium was discontinued, the withdrawal symptoms would have been interpreted as a new illness or a relapse of the original condition. Opium was often mixed with wine to create a drink that could knock a patient unconscious before a surgery. Imagine lying on a table while a barber surgeon prepared to amputate your infected leg with a saw. Your only comfort, a cup of wine heavily laced with opium. If you were lucky, you'd drift into a stupor that dulled the pain. If you weren't, you'd remain semi-conscious through the entire ordeal. The use of opium wasn't limited to surgery. It was also used to treat chronic conditions like arthritis, to calm colicky babies, and to help insomniacs sleep. However, access to opium was limited and expensive, so only the wealthy or those treated by skilled physicians typically benefited from it. The addictive properties of opium were recognized to some extent, though the understanding of addiction was primitive compared to modern knowledge. Hemp, the plant from which cannabis is derived, was widely grown in medieval Europe, but primarily for industrial purposes. The strong fibers of the hemp plant were used to make rope, canvas, and textiles, which were essential for everything from ship's rigging to peasants' clothing. However, medieval people were also aware of the psychoactive properties of cannabis, though it was far less commonly used for intoxication in Europe than in other parts of the world. In the Middle East and Asia, cannabis had a long history of use for both medicinal and recreational purposes, and this knowledge filtered into Europe through trade and cultural exchange. Some medieval medical texts mention cannabis as a treatment for pain, inflammation, and various other ailments. There are also scattered references to its use for achieving altered states of consciousness, though these are rare and often ambiguous. The legendary story of the Assassins, a secretive group of warriors in the medieval Islamic world, includes claims that they used hashish, a concentrated form of cannabis, to prepare for their missions. The word assassin is sometimes said to derive from hashishin, meaning users of hashish. While modern historians debate the accuracy of these accounts, the story was widely believed in medieval Europe and contributed to a sense of mystery and danger surrounding cannabis. For most Europeans, though, hemp remained a practical crop rather than a source of intoxication. If people did experiment with smoking or consuming hemp flowers, it left little trace in the historical record. Hallucinogenic plants held a particularly fascinating and dangerous place in medieval society. Several plants native to Europe contain powerful psychoactive compounds, and knowledge of these plants was passed down through folk traditions. Henbane, mandrake, Belladonna and datura were all known to produce vivid hallucinations, along with other effects ranging from euphoria to delirium to death. These plants contain alkaloids like atropine, scopolamine, and hyoscyamine, which affect the nervous system in profound ways. In small doses, they might be used medicinally to treat pain, induce sleep, or calm spasms. In larger doses, they could transport the user to an entirely different reality, or kill them outright. Henbane was perhaps the most widely known of these dangerous plants. It grew commonly in waste areas, along roadsides, and in disturbed soil, making it readily available throughout Europe. The plant has sticky, hairy leaves and bell-shaped flowers that are pale yellow with purple veins, giving it a distinctive appearance. All parts of the plant are poisonous, but the seeds are particularly potent. Medieval herbalists used henbane to treat toothaches, ease pain, and promote sleep. The plant was also associated with prophecy and divination, with some sources suggesting that it was burned as incense to induce visions. The smoke of burning henbane seeds would produce effects ranging from giddiness and confused speech to full-blown hallucinations, depending on the dose inhaled. The hallucinations produced by these plants are not like the geometric patterns and color distortions associated with substances like LSD or psilocybin mushrooms. Instead, they produce what are called anticholinergic hallucinations, which are intensely realistic and often terrifying. Users might see people, animals, or objects that aren't there, but seem completely real. They might hold conversations with people who don't exist, pick invisible objects off the ground, or believe they are in a completely different location. The sense of reality becomes utterly distorted, and users have no insight that they are hallucinating. They believe their experiences are real. This makes anticholinergic drugs particularly dangerous, as users might harm themselves or others while under their influence, acting on beliefs that have no basis in reality. The physical effects of these plants compound the danger. They cause a rapid heartbeat, dilated pupils, dry mouth, difficulty urinating, and elevated body temperature. In severe cases, users might develop dangerously high fevers, seizures, or slip into a coma. The line between a dose that produces interesting effects and a dose that proves fatal is narrow and varies from person to person. An experienced herbalist might successfully use these plants for years, developing a sense of appropriate dosages through trial and error. But a novice experimenting without guidance could easily take a fatal dose, and even experienced users could make mistakes, especially since the potency of plant material varies depending on growing conditions, the part of the plant used, and how it was prepared. Datura, related to henbane and belladonna, was known in medieval Europe, though it was more common in other parts of the world. Datura, related to henbane and belladonna, was known in medieval Europe, though it was more common in other parts of the world. The plant produces large, trumpet-shaped white flowers and spiny seed pods. Like its relatives, every part of Datura is poisonous, and it contains the same alkaloids that cause anticholinergic effects. Some sources suggest that Datura was used in medieval Europe as a component of witches' flying ointments, though evidence is limited. The plant's strong association with witchcraft and sorcery in later periods suggests it may have had similar associations in medieval times. The visions produced by datura are particularly intense and long-lasting, sometimes persisting for days, during which the user would be completely incapacitated and vulnerable. The transmission of knowledge about these dangerous plants raises interesting questions about medieval society. How did people learn which plants were safe and which were deadly? How did they learn the difference between a dose that healed and a dose that killed? The answer lies in oral tradition, passed down through generations of healers, midwives, and herbalists. This knowledge was practical and experiential, learned through apprenticeship and observation rather than from books. A young woman learning healing from her mother or grandmother would be taught which plants to gather, how to identify them correctly, when to harvest them for maximum potency, and how to prepare them safely. This education might take years, with the novice gradually being entrusted with more dangerous and powerful medicines as her skill grew. The Church's attitude toward this knowledge was profoundly ambivalent. On one hand, healing the sick was a Christian duty, and many monks and nuns were skilled herbalists who cultivated medicinal gardens and treated the ill. On the other hand, knowledge passed down through folk tradition, especially knowledge held by women outside the Church's authority, was suspect. The line between healing and magic was never clear, and a woman who could cure might also be accused of causing harm through poisoning or sorcery. The same plants that healed could kill, and the same knowledge that made someone a valued healer could make them a target for accusations of witchcraft. Mandrake root was particularly notorious and surrounded by superstition. The root often grew in a vaguely humanoid shape, which led to beliefs that it was a magical plant. According to legend, Mandrake would shriek when pulled from the ground, and anyone who heard this scream would die or go mad. To harvest it safely, people supposedly tied a dog to the plant and then made the dog pull it up, sacrificing the animal to avoid the curse. Whether anyone actually did this is questionable, but the stories reflect the fear and reverence that surrounded this plant. Mandrake was used in various potions and remedies, and its psychoactive effects were well known. It could cause drowsiness, hallucinations, and a sense of detachment from reality. Belladonna, also called deadly nightshade, was equally dangerous and equally fascinating. The name Belladonna means beautiful lady in Italian, supposedly because women used diluted extracts to dilate their pupils, which was considered attractive. However, the plant was also used in witchcraft and folk magic. Belladonna could cause intense hallucinations, a racing heart, confusion, and, in overdose, death. The line between a dose that produced visions and a dose that proved fatal was perilously thin. Medieval herbalists and healers had to possess considerable knowledge to use such plants safely, and many people undoubtedly died from accidental poisonings. The association between hallucinogenic plants and witchcraft is one of the most intriguing aspects of medieval drug use. During the late medieval period and into the early modern era, Europe was gripped by a moral panic about witchcraft. Thousands of people, mostly women, were accused of practicing magic, consorting with demons, and flying through the night to attend witches' sabbaths. While much of the witch hysteria was driven by religious extremism, social tensions, and misogyny, there may have been a kernel of truth to some of the stranger accusations, not because magic was real, but because some people were using hallucinogenic substances. Historical accounts describe witches creating ointments or salves from plants like belladonna, henbane, and datura, mixed with fats that would help the compounds absorb through the skin. These ointments were supposedly rubbed onto the body or onto a staff or broomstick, which the witch would then straddle. The combination of hallucinogenic plants and the power of suggestion could produce intense, realistic sensations of flying or shape-shifting. Modern experiments with recreating these formulas under controlled conditions have shown that they can indeed produce such effects. A person under the influence of these substances might genuinely believe they had flown through the air or transformed into an animal, and upon coming down from the experience, they might recount these events as real. Of course, the vast majority of people accused of witchcraft were innocent and never used any such substances. The confessions extracted during witch trials were usually the result of torture, leading, and forced testimony. But the existence of hallucinogenic folk practices provides a fascinating glimpse into the hidden world of medieval consciousness alteration. These weren't recreational drugs in the modern sense. They were dangerous, unpredictable substances used in contexts of ritual, healing, or magic. The people who used them were often village healers, midwives, or others with specialized knowledge of herbs, and they occupied a liminal space in medieval society, both needed and feared. Ergot poisoning represents an entirely different category of medieval intoxication, one that was accidental and often catastrophic. Ergot is a fungus that grows on rye and other grains, particularly in damp conditions. When infected grain is ground into flour and baked into bread, the ergot alkaloids survive and can cause a condition known as ergotism. The symptoms of ergot poisoning are truly horrific. Victims might experience convulsions, hallucinations, a sensation of burning in the limbs, and in severe cases, gangrene that caused fingers and toes to turn black and fall off. In the medieval period, this condition was known as Saint Anthony's fire, named after the saint to whom sufferers prayed for relief. Outbreaks of ergotism occurred periodically throughout medieval Europe, sometimes affecting entire villages or regions. Because the cause wasn't understood, these outbreaks were often attributed to divine punishment, demonic possession, or witchcraft. The hallucinatory effects of ergot were particularly disturbing. People under its influence might see visions of demons, feel insects crawling on their skin, or believe they were being burned alive. These experiences could last for days or weeks, and the terror they induced was profound. Some historians have speculated that ergot poisoning might explain some of the stranger episodes in medieval history, such as incidents of mass hysteria or visions reported by religious mystics. The gangrenous form of ergotism was particularly gruesome and terrifying. The alkaloids in ergot constrict blood vessels, cutting off circulation to the extremities. Victims would first experience tingling and numbness in their fingers and toes, followed by intense pain. The affected limbs would turn dark, then black, as the tissue died from lack of blood flow. Eventually, the dead tissue would fall off or have to be amputated. People suffering from this condition were said to feel as though their limbs were on fire, hence the name Saint. Anthony's fire. Anthony's fire. The pain was excruciating and unrelenting, and there was nothing medieval medicine could do to help. Some victims lost all their fingers and toes, becoming permanently disabled. Others died from infection or from the systemic effects of the poisoning. The convulsive form of ergotism manifested differently, with victims experiencing seizures, muscle spasms, and mental disturbances.
They might twitch and jerk uncontrollably, suffer from painful cramps, and experience episodes of mania or delirium.
This form of the condition was especially likely to be interpreted as demonic possession, since the victim's behavior was so disturbing and inexplicable. Exorcisms would be performed, prayers would be said, but nothing would help until the ergot-contaminated grain was no longer being consumed. The problem was that no one knew what was causing the outbreaks, so people would continue eating the poisoned bread until the supply ran out, or until someone made the connection and destroyed the contaminated grain.
The geographic pattern of ergotism outbreaks provides clues to its cause.
Regions where rye was a staple crop were more vulnerable, particularly in northern Europe, where the cooler, wetter climate favored both rye cultivation and fungal growth. Areas that primarily consumed wheat were less affected, since wheat is less susceptible to ergot infection. The timing of outbreaks also followed a pattern, typically occurring after wet growing seasons when fungal infections would be more common.
But without a scientific understanding of microbiology and plant diseases, medieval people couldn't identify these patterns or take preventative action. They simply suffered through the outbreaks and prayed for relief.
Some historians have proposed that ergot poisoning might explain certain famous historical events. The Salem witch trials in colonial Massachusetts, for instance, have been linked to possible ergotism, with the accuser's strange behavior and visions potentially resulting from contaminated grain. While this theory is controversial and not universally accepted, it illustrates how ergot poisoning could have influenced history in unexpected ways.
In medieval Europe, mass outbreaks of dancing mania or dancing plague, where groups of people would dance frantically for days until they collapsed from exhaustion, have also been speculatively linked to ergotism.
These events remain mysterious, but the hallucinogenic and convulsive effects of ergot are consistent with the reported symptoms. Monasteries and religious institutions kept records of ergotism outbreaks, often describing them as visitations of divine wrath or tests of faith. The Order of Saint Anthony became particularly associated with treating ergotism victims, establishing hospitals where sufferers could receive care. The treatment offered was mostly supportive: food, shelter, and spiritual comfort. But simply removing victims from the source of contaminated grain would have allowed them to recover if they survived the acute phase of poisoning. The monks of St. Glyph. Anthony developed a reputation for miraculous healing powers, when in reality the key was probably just getting patients away from the ergot-laced bread they had been eating at home. The connection between the saint and the disease was so strong that the condition became known by his name, a title that persists in medical literature to this day. The connection between ergot and LSD is worth noting here. In the 20th century, the chemist Albert Hofmann was working with ergot alkaloids when he accidentally discovered LSD, one of the most powerful hallucinogens known. The medieval peasants who unknowingly consumed ergot-contaminated bread were experiencing something chemically similar to an LSD trip, though in a far less controlled and far more dangerous form. The unpredictability and severity of ergot poisoning meant that it was never used intentionally as a drug in medieval times. It was simply a tragic consequence of agricultural conditions and lack of scientific knowledge. Medieval medicine's approach to mind-altering substances was inseparable from the broader medical philosophy of the time. Physicians operated according to the theory of the four humors: blood,
phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, which were thought to govern health and personality.
Illness resulted from an imbalance in these humors, and treatment aimed to restore equilibrium. Many substances we would now recognize as drugs were classified as medicines and used to adjust humoral balance. Wine, for example, was considered hot and dry, making it useful for treating cold and wet conditions. Opium was believed to cool and dry the body, making it appropriate for hot, moist ailments. This humoral theory dominated medical thinking throughout the medieval period and into the early modern era. It originated with ancient Greek physicians, particularly Hippocrates and Galen, whose works were preserved and transmitted through Byzantine and Islamic scholars before being reintroduced to Western Europe. According to the theory, each person had a unique balance of the four humors, which determined their temperament and susceptibility to disease. Someone with an excess of blood was sanguine, cheerful, social, and prone to bleeding disorders. Excess phlegm created a phlegmatic temperament, calm, slow, and prone to respiratory ailments. Too much yellow bile made a person choleric, quick-tempered, ambitious, and prone to fevers. An excess of black bile caused a melancholic temperament, thoughtful, artistic, but prone to depression and digestive problems. Treatment involved not just medicines, but also diet, lifestyle changes, and sometimes dramatic interventions like bloodletting or purging. Physicians would prescribe substances based on their humoral properties to counteract the patient's imbalance. A feverish patient with too much yellow bile might be given cooling, moistening remedies like cucumber or lettuce, along with bloodletting to reduce the excess heat in the body. A patient suffering from melancholy might receive warm, dry substances like wine and spices to counteract the cold, wet nature of black bile. The psychoactive effects of these substances were understood as part of their humoral action, with intoxication representing a temporary shift in humoral balance. The concept of complexion, related to temperament but more specific to physical constitution, also influenced prescribing practices. A physician had to consider not just the disease, but also the patient's natural complexion. A hot, dry remedy might cure a cold, wet disease in one patient, but make another patient sicker if their natural constitution was already hot and dry. This individualized approach to medicine meant that two patients with the same symptoms might receive completely different treatments based on the physician's assessment of their underlying humoral balance. In practice, this created a system that was flexible and could accommodate contradictory outcomes. If a treatment worked, the diagnosis was correct. If it failed, the physician had misjudged the patient's complexion or the nature of the disease. Physicians also used substances derived from animals and minerals, creating complex remedies that might contain dozens of ingredients. Theriac, a legendary cure-all, supposedly contained more than 60 different components, including opium, viper flesh, and various herbs and spices. This concoction was believed to cure everything from poisoning to plague, and it remained popular for centuries despite questionable effectiveness. The opium in theriac was likely the only ingredient that produced any noticeable effect, providing pain relief and a sense of euphoria that convinced patients the medicine was working. The recipe for the theriac was enormously complex and varied from one pharmacy to another, though certain key ingredients were considered essential. The base typically included opium, which provided the medicine's primary therapeutic effect, along with viper flesh, which was thought to provide protection against poisons and venomous bites. The logic was sympathetic. The poison of the viper would protect against other poisons. Various exotic spices and herbs were added, including cinnamon, ginger, myrrh, saffron, and dozens of others. Some recipes called for ingredients that had to be imported from distant lands at enormous expense, making theriac a luxury medicine affordable only to the wealthy. The preparation of theriac was treated as an almost magical process, with specific procedures that had to be followed exactly. The ingredients had to be gathered at particular times, prepared in a specific order, and allowed to age for years before the medicine would reach its full potency. In some cities, the compounding of theriac was done publicly, with apothecaries preparing large batches in view of city officials who would certify its authenticity. This public ceremony served both to validate the medicine's quality and to maintain the mystique surrounding it. The finished product was thick, dark, and intensely bitter, usually taken mixed with wine to make it palatable. Wealthy patients might take small doses of theriac regularly as a preventative medicine, believing it would protect them from disease and poisoning. Other complex medicines followed similar principles, combining multiple ingredients in the hope that the resulting mixture would be more powerful than any single component. Mithridatum, named after King Mithridates VI of Pontus, who supposedly made himself immune to poison by taking small doses daily, was similar to theriac but contained fewer ingredients. The concept of building immunity through exposure to poisons was well established in medieval thought, and these complex remedies were seen as embodying this principle. Whether they actually did anything beyond the effects of their opium content is doubtful, but the placebo effect combined with opium's real analgesic properties probably did provide some benefit to patients. Physicians disagreed about which medicines were most effective and what their proper uses were. Medical education in medieval universities involved studying ancient texts and engaging in theoretical debates about humoral properties and the nature of disease, but relatively little practical clinical experience. A physician who had spent years studying at a prestigious university might know all the classical theories but have limited experience actually treating patients. In contrast, folk healers, barber surgeons, and midwives learned through apprenticeship and direct experience. They might not be able to cite Galen or explain humoral theory, but they knew what remedies worked in practice. This created tension between academic medicine and folk healing, with university-trained physicians often dismissing traditional remedies as superstition, while simultaneously borrowing from folk practices when it suited them. Alcohol was widely used in medieval medicine, both as a solvent for other ingredients and as a medicine in its own right. Wine was believed to aid digestion, warm the body, and strengthen the heart. In an era before germ theory, when the actual mechanisms of disease were completely unknown, these beliefs were based on observation and tradition rather than scientific evidence. Some medieval treatments did have genuine therapeutic value. Willow bark, which contains the precursor to aspirin, was used to reduce fever and pain, but many others were useless or actively harmful. The use of alcohol as a solvent was particularly important for medieval pharmacy. Many medicinal compounds are not water-soluble, but will dissolve in alcohol, making alcoholic extracts or tinctures an effective way to prepare medicines. Medieval apothecaries would steep herbs in wine or distilled spirits for days or weeks, allowing the active compounds to dissolve into the liquid. The resulting tincture could be administered in small doses, providing a concentrated form of the medicine. This technique was effective for many plants and allowed physicians to prescribe precise doses rather than having patients chew raw herbs or drink large volumes of weak tea. Distilled spirits, which have a much higher alcohol content than wine or beer, began to appear in Europe during the later medieval period. The technique of distillation had been known in the Islamic world for centuries, used primarily to create perfumes and medicines. European alchemists and physicians learned the technique and began applying it to wine, creating aqua vitae, water of life, a clear, potent spirit. Early aqua vitae was considered purely medicinal, too strong and harsh-tasting to drink for pleasure. Physicians prescribed it for a variety of ailments, believing it had powerful warming and stimulating properties. Patients would take small sips mixed with water, honey, or herbs to make it more palatable. The development of distillation technology gradually improved, allowing for the production of purer and stronger spirits. By the end of the medieval period, distilled beverages were beginning to transition from medicine to recreation, though this shift would not be complete until later centuries. The equipment required for distillation, copper stills, condensing coils, and careful temperature control meant that only specialists could produce distilled spirits. Monasteries and apothecaries were the primary producers, maintaining the association between strong spirits and medicine. The idea that a substance as intoxicating as distilled alcohol could be a medicine might seem paradoxical to modern thinking, but medieval physicians saw the intoxicating effect as evidence of the spirit's power and efficacy. Regional variations in medical practice meant that approaches to drug use varied across Europe. In Southern Europe, particularly Italy, Greek and Arabic medical texts were more readily available, and universities like Salerno developed strong traditions of medical scholarship. Northern European medicine was more influenced by local folk traditions and had less access to classical texts until later in the medieval period. These regional differences affected which substances were used and how they were understood. A physician in Toledo might prescribe a sophisticated remedy based on Arabic pharmacology, while a healer in rural England might rely on local herbs and traditional preparations passed down through generations. Both approaches claimed effectiveness, and both had their successes and failures. The Church's relationship with intoxicating substances was complex and often contradictory. On one hand, alcohol was central to Christian ritual. Wine represented the blood of Christ in communion, and monasteries were centers of both beer and wine production. Monks drank regularly as part of their daily routine, and many monastic orders had reputations for producing exceptional beverages. On the other hand, the Church condemned excessive drinking and drunkenness as sinful. Gluttony, which included overindulgence in food and drink, was one of the 7 deadly sins. Priests preached against the moral dangers of intoxication, warning that it led to lust, violence, and spiritual corruption. This tension between use and abuse created a nuanced approach to alcohol in medieval Christian society. Moderate drinking was not only accepted but encouraged, as it was seen as part of God's provision for humanity. The Bible itself contains numerous references to wine, including Jesus' first miracle of turning water into wine at the wedding at Cana. However, the line between moderate and excessive drinking was subjective and often debated.
Some religious reformers argued for stricter temperance, while others defended the traditional place of alcohol in daily life and worship.
Monastic life was structured around a daily routine that included regular consumption of alcohol. The Rule of Saint Benedict, which governed many monasteries, specified that monks should receive a daily allowance of wine, a hymena, roughly half a liter. This was considered moderate and appropriate for maintaining health and strength. Monks who were ill, elderly, or engaged in particularly hard labor might receive extra rations. Beer was also provided, especially in northern regions where wine was expensive or unavailable. The monastery's cellarer, the monk responsible for provisions, had the important task of ensuring an adequate supply of drink throughout the year. Monasteries maintained extensive vineyards and brewhouses, and the quality of their products became a source of pride and income. The timing of drinking within the monastic day was also regulated. Monks typically broke their fast at midday with a meal that included wine. The evening meal, taken after Vespers, also included wine. Drinking outside of meals was generally discouraged, though some leeway was given during feast days and celebrations. The combination of regular but controlled drinking, communal oversight, and the structured nature of monastic life meant that problem drinking among monks was probably less common than in secular society, though it certainly occurred. Monastery records occasionally mention disciplinary actions against monks who drank to excess, suggesting that even within the regulated environment of the cloister, some individuals struggled with alcohol. The production of high-quality beverages by monasteries served multiple purposes beyond simply providing for the monks' own consumption. Selling surplus wine and beer generated income that could fund the monastery's charitable works, maintain its buildings, and support its religious mission. Monasteries often provided hospitality to travelers, offering food, shelter, and drink to pilgrims, merchants, and other visitors. This hospitality was seen as a Christian duty, and the quality of what was offered reflected on the monastery's reputation. Guests of higher social status would receive better wine, while common travelers might receive simple beer. The monastery's guest house became an extension of its spiritual mission, a place where the secular world and the religious community intersected. Some monastic orders developed distinctive approaches to alcohol. The Cistercians, for instance, were known for their excellent winemaking, particularly in Burgundy, where Cistercian monks cultivated the vineyards that would later produce some of France's most famous wines. They approached viticulture with the same rigor and attention to detail they brought to other aspects of their spiritual practice, believing that excellence in their work glorified God. The Benedictines also produced fine wines and beers, and their monasteries became centers of agricultural innovation. The techniques and traditions developed by medieval monks influenced European winemaking and brewing for centuries afterward, and many modern breweries and wineries trace their origins to monastic foundations. Other mind-altering substances received harsher treatment from the Church. Anything associated with paganism, folk magic, or non-Christian traditions was viewed with deep suspicion. The use of hallucinogenic plants in ritual contexts was particularly condemned, as it was believed to involve consorting with demons or Satan himself. The Church's persecution of folk healers and herbalists, especially women, was partly motivated by fear of these ancient practices that existed outside official religious authority. Knowledge of powerful plants and their effects was seen as potentially dangerous, and those who possessed such knowledge could easily be accused of witchcraft. The ecclesiastical courts had jurisdiction over moral offenses, including those related to substance use when they involved sin rather than simply breaking secular law. A person who habitually got drunk might be called before a church court and required to do penance, which could involve fasting, prayer, or public confession of their sin. Repeat offenders might face more serious penalties, including excommunication in extreme cases. However, the Church's ability to enforce moral behavior was limited, and many people ignored or flouted the pronouncements of priests. The secular authorities, who were often more concerned with maintaining public order and collecting taxes than with enforcing moral standards, sometimes took a more lenient approach to drinking and intoxication. The Church's attitude toward pain relief and medical use of intoxicating substances was generally more permissive. Alleviating suffering was seen as charitable and godly, so the use of opium for severe pain or wine mixed with herbs to calm a patient was acceptable. However, the line between legitimate medical use and illicit intoxication was not always clear. A person taking opium for genuine pain might find themselves dependent on it, and the question of whether continued use was medical necessity or sinful indulgence became murky. Medieval theological writings address these questions without reaching definitive answers, reflecting the genuine complexity of the issues involved. Social class played a significant role in determining who had access to various substances and how their use was perceived. The wealthy could afford imported wines, exotic spices, and expensive medicinal preparations containing opium or other rare ingredients. A nobleman suffering from gout might receive a carefully prepared tincture containing multiple drugs, while a peasant with the same condition would have to make do with whatever local herbs were available. This disparity extended to the quality of alcohol as well. The rich drank aged wines from prestigious regions, while the poor consumed whatever cheap local ale or wine they could afford, which was often of poor quality and sometimes downright toxic. Interestingly, some substances that were restricted by cost became more available during certain historical moments. When trade routes opened or new sources were discovered, prices could drop, making previously rare items more accessible to the middle classes. The Crusades, for example, brought European soldiers and merchants into direct contact with the Islamic world, where they encountered new substances, medicines, and ways of using familiar plants. This cross-cultural exchange enriched European pharmacology and introduced new intoxicants and medicines to Western markets. The Crusades had profound effects on European culture beyond their stated religious purposes. Crusaders returning from the Holy Land brought back not just stories and plunder, but also knowledge. They had experienced different climates, tasted exotic foods and drinks, and witnessed medical practices more advanced than what existed in Europe at the time. Islamic civilization during the medieval period was far ahead of Christian Europe in many fields, including medicine, chemistry, and pharmacy. The translation movement that brought Arabic scientific and medical texts into Latin made this knowledge available to European scholars, fundamentally changing how medicine was practiced and understood. Spices, which arrived in Europe through these same trade networks, became enormously valuable, both as flavoring for food and as medicines. Black pepper, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, ginger, and many others were worth their weight in silver or even gold. These spices were not merely condiments, they were believed to have powerful medicinal properties and were incorporated into countless remedies. Some spices had genuine physiological effects beyond their flavor. Nutmeg, for instance, contains compounds that can produce mild hallucinogenic effects when consumed in large quantities, though the dose required also causes severe nausea and other unpleasant side effects. Medieval people probably didn't consume nutmeg in quantities sufficient to cause these effects, but the spice's warming, stimulating properties were valued and may have contributed to a subtle sense of well-being when consumed. The economic importance of the spice trade cannot be overstated. Control of the routes by which spices reached Europe was a source of enormous wealth and power. Venice grew rich by dominating Mediterranean trade with the East, while Genoa competed for the same markets. The desire to find new routes to the sources of spices, bypassing the expensive intermediaries who controlled the traditional routes, would eventually drive European exploration and the Age of Discovery. The mind-altering and medicinal substances that came from Asia were thus intimately connected to the larger sweep of European history, influencing politics, economics, and eventually leading to the colonization of much of the world. Sugar, which arrived in Europe through similar trade routes, was initially classified as a medicine and sold by apothecaries rather than food merchants. It was considered warming and moistening in humoral terms, good for the lungs and throat. Wealthy people consumed sugar mixed with spices in elaborate confections that were thought to be healthful as well as delicious. The modern association of sugar with empty calories and health problems would have been incomprehensible to medieval people who saw it as a valuable medicine. Only gradually, as sugar production increased and prices fell, did it transition from medicine to luxury food to everyday commodity. This trajectory from rare medicine to common foodstuff is a pattern we see with many substances throughout history. Warfare in medieval times had its own relationship with intoxication. Soldiers often drank heavily before battle, both to bolster courage and to dull fear. A drunk soldier might be braver, or at least more reckless, though also less coordinated and strategic. Some accounts suggest that commanders provided alcohol to troops before major engagements, knowing it would make them more willing to charge into deadly situations. The Vikings were famous for their berserkers, warriors who supposedly worked themselves into a trance-like battle fury. While the exact nature of this state is debated, some historians have speculated that berserkers might have used hallucinogenic mushrooms, particularly Amanita muscaria, to achieve their fearsome battle rage. The concept of the berserker is fascinating and has captured imaginations for centuries. These warriors were described in sagas and historical accounts as fighting with superhuman strength and ferocity, seemingly impervious to pain and fear. They would bite their shields, howl like wild animals, and throw themselves into battle with reckless abandon. The word berserker itself comes from Old Norse and likely means either bear shirt or bear shirt, referring to the bear skins they supposedly wore or to fighting without armor. After battle, berserkers would supposedly collapse in exhaustion, sleeping deeply for days. The mushroom theory attempts to explain these behaviors through pharmacology. Amanita muscaria, the red-capped mushroom with white spots familiar from fairy tales, contains mucimol and ibotenic acid, which affect the brain in ways quite different from psilocybin mushrooms. The effects include euphoria, altered perception, increased energy, and, in higher doses, delirium and unconsciousness. Some of the specific symptoms match accounts of berserker behavior: the sense of enormous strength, reduced pain sensitivity, and altered mental state. The exhaustion and deep sleep that followed could correspond to the come-down from the drug. However, Amanita muscaria is also unpredictable and can cause severe nausea, making it a questionable choice for warriors about to fight. Other explanations for berserker behavior have been proposed. Some scholars suggest it was a psychological state induced through ritual, training, and self-hypnosis rather than drugs. Warriors might work themselves into a dissociative state through rhythmic movement, chanting, and deliberate arousal of aggressive emotions. Others have pointed to medical conditions like epilepsy or psychiatric disorders as possible explanations for some individuals who exhibited berserker-like symptoms. The truth is probably complex, with different individuals achieving altered states through different means, and saga accounts exaggerating or mythologizing real phenomena. Regardless of the mechanism, the deliberate alteration of consciousness before combat was widespread across many cultures, not just the Vikings. Warriors throughout history have sought ways to overcome the natural fear and hesitation that might keep them from closing with the enemy. Alcohol was the most common method, but rituals, group chanting, war dances, and perhaps psychoactive substances all served similar purposes. The act of preparing for battle, whether through drinking, taking drugs, or performing rituals, helped warriors transition from their normal state of mind to one where they could face death without flinching. Medieval European armies relied heavily on alcohol to maintain morale. Military campaigns included baggage trains carrying barrels of wine or beer, and soldiers expected regular rations of drink along with their food. Commanders who failed to provide adequate alcohol risked mutiny or desertion. After battles or during sieges, when regular supply lines might be disrupted, alcohol shortages could seriously affect fighting effectiveness. Conversely, the capture of an enemy's supply of wine or beer was a prize worth celebrating, both for the intrinsic value of the alcohol and for the blow struck against enemy morale. The injuries sustained in medieval warfare were horrific, and treatment options were limited. Soldiers wounded by swords, axes, arrows, or pikes faced excruciating pain, blood loss, and the near certainty of infection if they survived the initial injury. The battlefield physicians, often barber surgeons with limited training, did what they could with primitive tools and techniques. Alcohol and opium were the primary means of pain relief available. A wounded soldier might be given wine to drink before his wound was cauterized with a red-hot iron, the alcohol dulling the pain slightly while also providing calories and hydration. In better supplied armies, opium might be available for more severe cases, though its expense meant it was often reserved for officers rather than common soldiers. Amanita muscaria, the iconic red mushroom with white spots, does have psychoactive properties, though they differ significantly from the psilocybin mushrooms that became famous in modern times. Amanita muscaria contains muscimol and ibotenic acid, which can cause effects ranging from euphoria and altered perception to confusion, nausea, and unconsciousness. The mushroom has a long history of use in shamanic practices in Siberia and other northern regions, and it's possible this knowledge reached Scandinavia. However, the evidence for Viking berserkers using mushrooms is circumstantial and debated among historians. What is certain is that warriors throughout history have sought ways to alter their mental state before combat, whether through substances, ritual, or psychological preparation. The shamanic traditions of Siberia provide one of the few well-documented examples of Amanita muscaria use. Shamans would consume the mushrooms as part of religious ceremonies, seeking visions and communication with the spirit world. The mushroom was considered sacred, and its use was surrounded by elaborate rituals and taboos. One peculiar aspect of Amanita muscaria is that the psychoactive compounds are excreted in urine largely unchanged, meaning that drinking the urine of someone who has consumed the mushroom can produce similar effects. Some Siberian peoples practiced this, as it was believed to filter out some of the compounds that cause nausea while preserving the psychoactive effects. This practice, while shocking to modern sensibilities, demonstrates the lengths to which people would go to achieve altered states of consciousness. Whether such practices ever existed in medieval Europe is unknown. The mushroom certainly grew in European forests, and people would have been familiar with it, but written records of its use are scarce. The association between mushrooms generally and magic or the supernatural was strong in European folklore, with fairy rings and mushroom circles believed to be places where fairies danced. Eating certain mushrooms was known to be dangerous, and folk wisdom warned against unfamiliar varieties. It's possible that some individuals or groups experimented with Amanita muscaria and discovered its properties, but if so, this knowledge remained marginal and largely unrecorded. The risks associated with Amanita muscaria are considerable. The potency of individual mushrooms varies greatly depending on growing conditions, the part of the mushroom consumed, and whether the mushrooms have been dried or processed. An experienced user might have some sense of appropriate dosages, but a novice could easily consume too much, leading to severe intoxication, unconsciousness, or even death. The nausea and vomiting that often accompany Amanita muscaria use would make it an unappealing drug for most people, and the unpredictability of effects would make it particularly unsuitable for any context where reliable performance was required, like warfare. These practical considerations make the berserker mushroom connection questionable, though not impossible. The end of the medieval period and the beginning of the early modern era brought significant changes to patterns of substance use in Europe. The Protestant Reformation challenged the Catholic Church's authority and also its attitudes toward pleasure and indulgence. Some Protestant reformers advocated for stricter temperance and condemned the drunkenness that was so common in medieval society. The rise of coffee houses in the 17th century provided an alternative to the tavern culture, offering a stimulating beverage that enhanced alertness rather than producing intoxication. Coffee, tea, and chocolate arrived in Europe from the Americas, Africa, and Asia, fundamentally changing social habits and attitudes toward mind-altering substances. The introduction of these new beverages marked a shift in European culture that would have profound long-term effects. Coffee arrived in Europe through trade with the Ottoman Empire and quickly gained popularity despite initial suspicion and even attempts to ban it. The first European coffee house opened in Venice in the mid-17th century, and the institution spread rapidly across the continent. Coffee houses became centers of intellectual exchange, where people gathered to discuss politics, philosophy, business, and current events. Unlike taverns, where alcohol loosened tongues but also clouded judgment, coffee houses promoted clear-thinking conversation and the exchange of ideas. The stimulating effects of caffeine complemented this new social function, keeping patrons alert and engaged rather than drowsy and intoxicated.
The contrast between coffeehouse culture and tavern culture reflected changing values and social structures.
The medieval tavern, with its emphasis on communal drinking, singing, and physical release, represented an older social order rooted in traditional hierarchies and face-to-face community bonds. The coffee house, with its emphasis on rational discourse, news, and business, represented the emerging modern world of commerce, science, and Enlightenment thinking. Both institutions served as social spaces, but they promoted different kinds of interaction and different relationships to intoxication and consciousness. Tea followed a similar trajectory, arriving in Europe in the 17th century and becoming enormously popular, particularly in Britain. Chocolate, initially consumed as a bitter beverage similar to the way the Aztecs and Maya had prepared it, also found a European market. These new stimulants didn't replace alcohol. Europeans continued to drink wine and beer in large quantities, but they added new options and new contexts for social interaction. The fact that these new beverages came from distant lands required complex trade networks and represented contact with exotic cultures added to their appeal and their perceived value. The age of exploration brought Europeans into contact with an entirely new pharmacopoeia from the Americas. Tobacco, cocaine, and various hallucinogenic plants used by indigenous peoples would eventually make their way to Europe, though their impact would be felt most strongly after the medieval period had ended. The medieval world was on the cusp of enormous transformation, with the Renaissance, the Scientific Revolution, and the colonial era just ahead. These changes would completely reshape how people understood substances, health, and consciousness itself. Tobacco deserves particular mention, even though its main impact came after the medieval period. The plant was unknown in Europe before Columbus's voyages to the Americas, where indigenous peoples cultivated it and used it in both recreational and ceremonial contexts. Spanish and Portuguese explorers brought tobacco back to Europe in the 16th century, and within a few decades it had spread across the continent. Initially valued for supposed medicinal properties, tobacco quickly became popular as a recreational drug. People smoked it in pipes, snuffed it as powder, or chewed it, finding that it produced a pleasant, mild stimulation along with a sense of relaxation. By the early 17th century, tobacco had become so popular that some authorities tried to ban or restrict it, arguing that it was harmful to health and morals. The rapid global spread of tobacco demonstrates how quickly a new drug could be integrated into cultures around the world. Within a century of its introduction to Europe, tobacco had reached Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, carried by merchants, sailors, and colonists. People from wildly different cultures and backgrounds found tobacco appealing, suggesting that the desire for mild intoxication and the pleasure of smoking transcend cultural boundaries. The addictive properties of nicotine ensured that once people started using tobacco, many found it difficult to stop, creating a stable market that made tobacco cultivation enormously profitable. The plantation system that developed to produce tobacco for export would shape the economies and societies of the Americas, with consequences that continue to reverberate today. The age of exploration brought Europeans into contact with an entirely new pharmacopoeia from the Americas. Tobacco, cocaine, and various hallucinogenic plants used by indigenous peoples would eventually make their way to Europe, though their impact would be felt most strongly after the medieval period had ended. The medieval world was on the cusp of enormous transformation, with the Renaissance, the scientific revolution, and the colonial era just ahead. These changes would completely reshape how people understood substances, health, and consciousness itself. Looking back at medieval substance use from our modern perspective, it's easy to judge or to assume that people in the past were simply ignorant or reckless. But context is everything. In a world without modern medicine, where pain was constant and death was always near, substances that offered relief, escape, or altered consciousness had immense value. In a world without clean water, alcohol wasn't just a way to get drunk, it was a way to stay alive. In a world without anesthesia, opium wasn't an addiction risk, it was the difference between unbearable agony and tolerable suffering. And in a world where life was brutal and short, the desire to escape reality for a few hours was entirely understandable. The harsh realities of medieval life are difficult for modern people to fully grasp. Infant mortality was so high that many families expected to lose half or more of their children before adulthood. Women faced a significant risk of death in childbirth with each pregnancy. Accidents, injuries, and infections that would be minor inconveniences today could be fatal in the medieval world. Dental problems caused agonizing pain that could last for months or years. Arthritis, back pain, and other chronic conditions were common and untreatable. The psychological toll of living with constant physical discomfort, surrounded by death and suffering, watching loved ones die while being powerless to help them, this was normal life for medieval people. In this context, the availability of substances that could dull pain, provide temporary escape, or alter consciousness takes on a different meaning. A peasant who spent his meager earnings on ale wasn't being irresponsible. He was making a rational choice to trade a few hours of relief for other goods. A merchant who used opium to manage chronic pain wasn't abusing drugs. He was using one of the few effective treatments available. A healer who knew how to use dangerous plants to ease suffering or induce visions was providing a valuable service to her community, even if the church viewed her knowledge with suspicion. These were people making the best choices they could with the options available to them, in a world that gave them few good options. The communal nature of medieval intoxication also provided benefits beyond the pharmacological effects of the substances themselves. Social isolation is harmful to mental and physical health, and the tavern culture, whatever its problems, ensured that people had regular social contact with others. The festivals and celebrations that punctuated the medieval year, with their sanctioned excess and communal drinking, reinforced social bonds and provided emotional release. The religious rituals that incorporated alcohol connected people to something larger than themselves and gave meaning to their suffering. These social and spiritual dimensions of substance use were as important as the chemical effects, and they helped people survive lives that were often harsh and short. Medieval people weren't passive victims of their circumstances, blindly following tradition without thought or intention. They made choices, developed expertise, and created cultural practices around substance use that reflected their values and met their needs. The fact that their understanding was based on observation and tradition rather than scientific method doesn't mean it was worthless. They knew which plants helped with specific ailments, even if they didn't understand the biochemical mechanisms involved. They knew that alcohol was safer than water, even if they didn't know about bacteria. They knew that opium relieved pain, even if they didn't understand opioid receptors. This practical, experiential knowledge was sophisticated in its own way and represented the accumulated wisdom of generations. At the same time, medieval people weren't naive about the dangers of intoxication. They recognized addiction, though they didn't use that word or understand it scientifically. They saw how excessive drinking destroyed lives, families, and communities. They knew that certain plants could kill as easily as they could heal. They understood that altered states of consciousness could be spiritually meaningful, but also spiritually dangerous. Their relationship with mind-altering substances was informed by centuries of experience, cultural tradition, and religious belief, creating a complex tapestry of use, misuse, healing, and harm. The moral and religious framework within which medieval people understood substance use was comprehensive and nuanced. The concept of temperance, one of the 4 cardinal virtues, emphasized moderation in all things, including drink. This didn't mean abstinence. The complete avoidance of alcohol would have been impractical and even unhealthy in the medieval context, but rather the appropriate use of alcohol in ways that supported life and community without leading to excess. The challenge, of course, was determining where the line between appropriate use and excess lay, and this was a matter of ongoing debate and individual judgment. The stories and moral exempla that circulated in medieval culture often featured cautionary tales about the dangers of drunkenness. These stories told of drunkards who committed terrible crimes, of families reduced to poverty by a father's drinking, of souls damned because their drunkenness prevented them from repenting before death. At the same time, other stories celebrated the joy of communal feasting and drinking, the miraculous provision of wine, and the proper enjoyment of God's gifts. The tension between these competing narratives reflected the real complexity of medieval attitudes. Alcohol was both gift and danger, blessing and curse, depending on how it was used. The legal systems of medieval Europe attempted to manage substance use and its consequences, though with mixed success. Laws regulated who could brew and sell alcohol, set standards for quality and pricing, and punished those who caused problems while intoxicated. The punishments varied depending on the severity of the offense and the status of the offender. A nobleman who got drunk and started a brawl might face different consequences than a peasant who did the same thing, reflecting the hierarchical nature of medieval justice. Repeat offenders might face escalating punishments, from fines to public humiliation in the stocks to imprisonment or exile in extreme cases. Some cities attempted more systematic regulation of drinking establishments and alcohol sales. London, for instance, had elaborate rules governing alehouses, including requirements for licensing, standards for the quality of ale, and restrictions on who could enter taverns and when. These regulations were enforced with varying degrees of success, and corruption and bribery were common. Tavern keepers might pay officials to overlook violations, or officials might selectively enforce rules to punish enemies or extract bribes. The regulatory system existed as much to generate revenue for authorities as to genuinely control substance use and its harms. The question of responsibility for harm done while intoxicated was debated by legal scholars and theologians. If a drunk person committed a crime, were they fully responsible for their actions, or did the alcohol diminish their culpability? different legal traditions reached different conclusions. Some held that choosing to drink meant accepting responsibility for whatever you did while drunk, since you knew that intoxication might impair your judgment. Others allowed for reduced responsibility in some cases, particularly if the drinker had been forced or tricked into excessive consumption. These debates anticipated modern legal and philosophical discussions about free will, responsibility, and the effects of intoxication on moral agency. One particularly interesting aspect of medieval intoxication was its communal nature. Getting drunk wasn't usually a solitary activity. It happened in taverns, at festivals, during harvest celebrations, and at weddings and funerals. These social contexts provided structure and meaning to drinking. A harvest festival where everyone drank together celebrated the community's survival and prosperity. A wake where mourners drank to honor the dead provided comfort and solidarity in the face of loss. Even the daily routine of stopping at the tavern after work served to strengthen social bonds among laborers, craftsmen, and neighbors. Alcohol was a social lubricant, facilitating conversation, negotiation, and community building. The rituals surrounding drinking varied by context and purpose. At formal feasts and banquets, elaborate drinking ceremonies reinforced social hierarchies and relationships. The order in which people were served, the quality of wine they received, where they sat, and who they toasted all conveyed information about status and relationships. A nobleman might ceremonially share a cup with an honored guest, symbolically creating or acknowledging a bond between them. The breaking of bread and sharing of wine at these events wasn't just about consuming food and drink, it was about performing social relationships and community membership. Religious festivals provided some of the most important contexts for communal drinking. Christmas, Easter, Saints' Days, and numerous other occasions throughout the year were marked by feasting and celebration. These festivals broke the routine of daily life and allowed for sanctioned excess. The church's calendar structured time and gave rhythm to the year, with periods of feasting alternating with periods of fasting. This cycle of abundance and restriction, indulgence and abstinence reflected deep theological ideas about sin and redemption, flesh and spirit, earthly pleasure and heavenly reward. Carnival season, the period before Lent, exemplified the medieval approach to celebrating intoxication and excess. During Carnival, normal social rules were temporarily suspended or inverted. People wore masks and costumes, engaged in rowdy behavior, consumed enormous quantities of food and drink, and generally indulged every appetite before the austere fasting season began. The world was turned upside down. Servants might dress as masters, men might dress as women, and behavior that would be scandalous at other times was tolerated or even encouraged. This sanctioned transgression served as a safety valve, allowing people to release tensions and frustrations before settling back into the normal order. The origins of Carnival lie in pre-Christian spring festivals, which were gradually incorporated into the Christian calendar. The Church attempted to Christianize these pagan celebrations while also trying to limit their excesses. This created a complex dynamic where Carnival was simultaneously part of official religious practice and a potential source of disorder and sin. Priests might preach against the excesses of Carnival even as they acknowledged its place in the calendar. The tension reflected the broader medieval ambivalence about pleasure, the body, and earthly enjoyment. And at weddings and funerals, These social contexts provided structure and meaning to drinking.
A harvest festival where everyone drank together celebrated the community's survival and prosperity. A wake where mourners drank to honor the dead provided comfort and solidarity in the face of loss. Even the daily routine of stopping at the tavern after work served to strengthen social bonds among laborers, craftsmen, and neighbors. Alcohol was a social lubricant, facilitating conversation, negotiation, and community building. This communal aspect extended to other substances as well. When a healer prepared a remedy containing powerful herbs, there was often ritual and ceremony involved. The preparation itself might include prayers, specific timing based on the phases of the moon, or other elements that we would now consider superstitious, but that served to frame the experience in meaningful ways. The patient receiving such a remedy wasn't just consuming a drug. They were participating in a tradition that connected them to their ancestors, their community, and their spiritual beliefs. This holistic approach recognized that healing involved more than just the physical body. The rituals surrounding plant medicine were often elaborate and precise. A healer might gather herbs only at certain times of day or during specific phases of the moon, believing that the plant's power varied with these cycles. Prayers or incantations might be spoken while harvesting, preparing, or administering the medicine. The patient might be instructed to perform certain actions or avoid others while taking the remedy. These practices, which might seem like superstition to modernize, served multiple functions. They ensured consistency in preparation and administration. They created psychological expectations that might enhance the placebo effect. They embedded the medicine within a larger framework of meaning that helped the patient make sense of their illness and treatment. The concept of the doctrine of signatures, popular in medieval herbalism, held that God had marked plants with signs indicating their medicinal uses. A plant with heart-shaped leaves might be good for heart conditions. A plant with yellow sap might treat jaundice, which yellowed the skin. A plant that grew near water might help with fluid retention. While this system had no scientific basis, it provided a framework for organizing botanical knowledge and making decisions about treatment. It also reflected the medieval worldview, where everything in creation had meaning and purpose, and where God had provided signs for humans to read and interpret. Folk healing traditions varied considerably across different regions of Europe, reflecting local plants, cultural traditions, and the influence of various ethnic and religious groups. In areas with significant Jewish populations, Jewish physicians and healers contributed their knowledge, which often included texts and practices preserved from ancient times. In Spain and southern Italy, Arabic and Islamic influences were strong, bringing sophisticated pharmacological knowledge. In remote rural areas, pre-Christian pagan practices survived and mixed with Christian elements, creating hybrid traditions that the Church viewed with suspicion but couldn't entirely suppress. The transmission of healing knowledge within families and communities was primarily oral, passed down through demonstration and apprenticeship rather than through written texts. A grandmother might teach her granddaughter which plants to gather and how to prepare them. A midwife might take on an apprentice who would learn through years of observation and gradually increasing responsibility. This oral tradition was flexible and adaptive, allowing for local variations and innovations, but it was also vulnerable to disruption. The death of a knowledgeable healer without an apprentice could mean the loss of generations of accumulated wisdom.
The persecution of healers, particularly women accused of witchcraft, resulted in the loss of vast amounts of traditional medical knowledge. The role of women in medieval substance use deserves special attention. Women were the primary brewers of beer for much of the medieval period, giving them economic power and specialized knowledge. They were also the healers and midwives who possessed knowledge of medicinal and magical plants. This expertise made them valuable to their communities, but also vulnerable to accusations of witchcraft, especially as the medieval period drew to a close and the witch trials began. The association between women, healing, and plant knowledge had ancient roots, going back to pre-Christian pagan traditions where female healers and priestesses held positions of authority. In many pre-Christian European religions, female deities were associated with healing, herbs, and magic. The goddesses who controlled these domains were powerful figures, and their priestesses wielded considerable authority. With the Christianization of Europe, these traditions didn't disappear, but went underground, persisting in folk practices and local customs. The wise women who knew herbs and charms occupied a space that was both Christian and pagan, orthodox and heterodox. They might invoke Christian saints and prayers, while also using techniques and plant knowledge that derived from older traditions. This religious ambiguity made them suspect in the eyes of church authorities. The persecution of these women during the witch trials represented, among other things, a reassertion of male control over medical knowledge and practice. As universities developed and medicine became increasingly professionalized in the late medieval and early modern periods, women were systematically excluded from formal medical training. The folk knowledge that had been passed down through generations of female healers was dismissed as superstition or condemned as witchcraft. Thousands of women were tortured and executed, and countless others lived in fear. This tragic chapter in European history had profound effects on the transmission of traditional knowledge about plants, medicines, and consciousness-altering substances. The witch trials themselves, which peaked in the 16th and 17th centuries but had roots in the late medieval period, reveal the dark side of medieval attitudes toward altered consciousness. The confessions extracted from accused witches, often under torture, described flying through the air, transforming into animals, and attending Sabbaths where they worshipped Satan. While some of these accounts might have been inspired by actual experiences with hallucinogenic substances, the majority were fabrications produced by torture, leading questions, and the accuser's own preconceptions about what witches did. The tragedy was compounded by the fact that the substances and practices that might have offered genuine relief from suffering became associated with evil and demonic activity. The impact of the witch trials on traditional healing practices cannot be overstated. Women who might have served their communities as healers for generations found themselves at risk of accusation if their treatments failed or if they had conflicts with neighbors. The knowledge of powerful plants, which could heal or harm depending on how they were used, became evidence of witchcraft rather than skill. Midwives, whose work involved matters of life and death and required knowledge of herbs to ease labor or manage complications, were particularly vulnerable. The association between female healing and witchcraft would persist for centuries, contributing to the marginalization of women in medicine and the loss of valuable traditional knowledge. Seasonal patterns also shaped medieval substance use. Harvest time was a period of heavy drinking as communities celebrated the successful gathering of crops that would sustain them through the winter. The grain and grapes harvested in late summer and fall were quickly turned into beer and wine, and festivals marked the transition from labor to rest. Winter was a time of relative scarcity, when food was rationed and alcohol consumption might decrease simply due to limited supply. Spring brought renewed hope and energy, along with the appearance of fresh herbs and plants that had medicinal or psychoactive properties. Summer meant longer days, outdoor gatherings, and the consumption of the lighter ales and wines that were produced throughout the year. The agricultural calendar dictated not just when substances were available, but also when their use was appropriate. The hard physical labor of planting, tending, and harvesting crops required sobriety and focus during working hours, though evening drinking was common, even during busy seasons. The winter months, when outdoor work was limited and people spent long hours indoors, saw different patterns of consumption. Preserved foods and stored grain could be converted into alcohol, and the darkness and cold of winter made the warmth and cheer of drinking more appealing. The celebration of winter festivals like Christmas involved elaborate feasting and drinking, providing bright spots in the darkest time of year. The cycle of feast and famine that characterized medieval life extended to substance availability. In good years, when harvests were abundant, there would be plenty of grain for both food and brewing, and celebrations might be particularly elaborate. In bad years, when crops failed or were damaged by weather or pests, grain would be reserved for food and brewing might be restricted or banned. These fluctuations in availability affected not just alcohol, but also medicinal substances derived from cultivated plants. A drought that damaged herb gardens might mean that certain remedies weren't available when needed. A wet year that promoted fungal growth might lead to ergot contamination and outbreaks of St. John's. Anthony's fire was a historical term used to describe a severe illness, often associated with outbreaks of ergot poisoning that caused burning sensations, convulsions, and even gangrene. Religious festivals dotted the medieval calendar, and many of these occasions involved sanctioned excess. Carnival, the period before Lent, was a time when normal rules were suspended and people were expected to indulge in food, drink, and celebration before the austere fasting season began. During Carnival, drunkenness was not only tolerated but almost mandatory as people sought to purge their desires before committing to weeks of self-denial. This pattern of feast and famine, indulgence and abstinence was woven into the rhythm of medieval life and reflected the Church's complex relationship with pleasure and the body. The concept of fasting as practiced in medieval Christianity was itself a kind of consciousness-altering practice. Extended periods of reduced food intake, combined with intensive prayer and meditation, could produce altered states of consciousness, including visions, euphoria, and mystical experiences. Some medieval mystics and saints reported extraordinary visions and divine revelations that came during extended fasts. Whether these experiences were purely spiritual or had a physiological component related to the effects of fasting on the brain is debatable, but medieval people understood fasting as a way to transcend the physical body and draw closer to God. In this sense, fasting represented the opposite of intoxication, a practice that sought altered consciousness through deprivation rather than consumption. The role of women in medieval substance use deserves special attention. Women were the primary brewers of beer for much of the medieval period, giving them economic power and specialized knowledge. They were also the healers and midwives who possessed knowledge of medicinal and magical plants. This expertise made them valuable to their communities, but also vulnerable to accusations of witchcraft, especially as the medieval period drew to a close and the witch trials began. The association between women, healing, and plant knowledge had ancient roots, going back to pre-Christian pagan traditions where female healers and priestesses held positions of authority. The persecution of these women during the witch trials represented, among other things, a reassertion of male control over medical knowledge and practice. As universities developed and medicine became increasingly professionalized in the late medieval and early modern periods, women were systematically excluded from formal medical training. The folk knowledge that had been passed down through generations of female healers was dismissed as superstition or condemned as witchcraft. Thousands of women were tortured and executed, and countless others lived in fear. This tragic chapter in European history had profound effects on the transmission of traditional knowledge about plants, medicines, and consciousness-altering substances. Seasonal patterns also shaped medieval substance use. Harvest time was a period of heavy drinking, as communities celebrated the successful gathering of crops that would sustain them through the winter. The grain and grapes harvested in late summer and fall were quickly turned into beer and wine, and festivals marked the transition from labor to rest. Winter was a time of relative scarcity, when food was rationed and alcohol consumption might decrease simply due to limited supply. Spring brought renewed hope and energy, along with the appearance of fresh herbs and plants that had medicinal or psychoactive properties. Summer meant longer days, outdoor gatherings, and the consumption of the lighter ales and wines that were produced throughout the year. Religious festivals dotted the medieval calendar, and many of these occasions involved sanctioned excess. Carnival, the period before Lent, was a time when normal rules were suspended and people were expected to indulge in food, drink, and celebration before the austere fasting season began. During Carnival, drunkenness was not only tolerated but almost mandatory, as people sought to purge their desires before committing to weeks of self-denial. This pattern of feast and famine, indulgence and abstinence was woven into the rhythm of medieval life and reflected the Church's complex relationship with pleasure and the body. The economic aspects of medieval substance production and trade were substantial. Brewing and winemaking were major industries that employed thousands of people and generated significant tax revenue for lords and kings. Taverns and alehouses were regulated by local authorities who issued licenses and collected fees. The trade in exotic spices and medicines, including opium and rare herbs, enriched merchants and drove exploration and conquest. Wars were fought over trade routes that brought these valuable commodities to European markets. The desire for new sources of wealth and new substances to exploit was one of the factors that would drive European expansion in the centuries to come. The taxation of alcohol was a major source of revenue for medieval governments at all levels. Kings, nobles, bishops, and city authorities all collected taxes on the production and sale of alcoholic beverages. These taxes might be levied on the raw materials used in brewing or winemaking, on the finished products, on the establishments that sold alcohol, or on some combination of these. The revenue generated was substantial and helped fund everything from castle construction to military campaigns to charitable works. The dependence of authorities on alcohol tax revenue gave them a vested interest in maintaining high levels of consumption, even as they might publicly condemn drunkenness and excess. The regulation of alcohol quality and pricing was theoretically designed to protect consumers, but it also served to ensure a steady flow of tax revenue. If brewers or vintners produced such poor quality products that people stopped buying them, or if prices were so high that consumption fell, tax revenues would decline. Conversely, if prices were too low, producers might go out of business, again reducing tax revenue. Authorities thus had to balance multiple competing interests: consumers who wanted good quality at low prices, producers who wanted high profits, and their own fiscal needs. This balancing act led to complex systems of regulation, licensing, and taxation that varied widely across different regions and time periods. The guilds that organized brewing, winemaking, and tavern keeping played important roles in regulating their trades and protecting their members' interests. Guild members agreed to maintain quality standards, respect pricing guidelines, and support each other against outside competition. In return, the guild provided training through the apprenticeship system, helped members in financial difficulty, and lobbied authorities for favorable regulations. The guilds also organized social and religious activities for their members, creating communities bound together by shared profession and mutual interest. Guild feasts and celebrations naturally featured abundant food and drink, and some guilds became famous for the quality of their parties. The international trade in wine created complex commercial networks that stretched across Europe. Wine from Bordeaux was shipped to England, where it was highly prized. German wines from the Rhine and Moselle valleys were exported throughout Northern Europe. Italian wines, particularly from Tuscany, found markets in France and beyond. This trade required sophisticated logistics, including transportation by ship and wagon, storage facilities, and financial instruments like letters of credit to facilitate payment. The merchants who organized this trade became wealthy and powerful, and some merchant families parlayed their wine trade profits into political influence and social advancement. The trade in medicinal substances was similarly lucrative and complex. Opium, spices, herbs, and other drugs had to be transported over long distances, often changing hands multiple times before reaching their final destination. The markup at each stage of the trade was substantial, reflecting the risks of transportation, the rarity of the goods, and the strong demand. Apothecaries in major cities maintained connections with far-flung suppliers, and the reputation of a pharmacy might depend on its ability to obtain rare and exotic ingredients. The most successful apothecaries became wealthy and respected members of urban communities, their shops serving as centers of medical knowledge and commerce. Medieval attitudes toward addiction and dependence were quite different from modern concepts. The word addiction, as we use it today, didn't exist in medieval vocabulary. People certainly recognized that some individuals drank excessively and seemed unable to stop, and this was condemned as a moral failing, a sin of gluttony and lack of self-control. The idea that addiction might be a medical condition requiring treatment was foreign to medieval thinking. Instead, excessive drinking was seen as a character flaw or a manifestation of spiritual weakness. This moral framework placed full responsibility on the individual and offered little in the way of help or understanding. The medieval understanding of habit and vice, drawn from classical philosophy and Christian theology, provided a framework for thinking about compulsive behavior. A vice was a settled disposition toward sin, developed through repeated acts. Someone who drank excessively repeatedly would develop the vice of intemperance, which would make it increasingly difficult for them to exercise self-control. This understanding recognized that repeated behavior changes a person, making future similar behavior more likely, which is not far from modern understandings of how addiction works. However, the medieval framework saw this entirely in moral terms. The solution was to strengthen the will through prayer, penance, and grace, not to address any underlying medical or psychological condition. The concept of demonic possession provided another framework for understanding behavior that seemed out of a person's control. Someone whose drinking had become compulsive and destructive might be thought to be under demonic influence. The demon was seen as exploiting the person's weakness and drawing them deeper into sin. Exorcism might be attempted with prayers and rituals designed to drive out the demon and free the person from its grip. Whether this was helpful to people suffering from what we would now call substance use disorder is doubtful, though the attention and spiritual support might have provided some psychological benefit. Similarly, physical dependence on substances like opium was observed, but not fully understood. A patient who had been taking opium for chronic pain might experience withdrawal symptoms if the drug was suddenly stopped, but these symptoms would be interpreted as a return or worsening of the original ailment rather than as a consequence of the body's adaptation to the drug. The biochemical understanding of tolerance and dependence was centuries away from being discovered. As a result, patients and physicians alike might conclude that the drug was simply becoming less effective, leading to increased dosages and deeper dependence without recognizing the cycle they were trapped in. Some medieval medical texts mention the danger of habituating patients to strong medicines like opium, suggesting an awareness that long-term use could create problems. Physicians were advised to use such medicines only when truly necessary, and to discontinue them as soon as possible. However, this advice was based on general principles of moderation and the humoral theory that long-term use of any powerful medicine would create imbalances, rather than on a specific understanding of physical dependence. In practice, the advice was probably often ignored, especially when dealing with chronic conditions where opium provided real relief that no other treatment could match. The social consequences of problem drinking were recognized and sometimes addressed through informal community mechanisms. A wife whose husband drank away his wages might appeal to relatives, neighbors, or community elders for help. The church might intervene, with a priest counseling the drunkard or requiring penance. In extreme cases, legal mechanisms might be invoked, with courts ordering a man to support his family or prohibiting him from taverns. However, these interventions were sporadic and often ineffective. The fundamental approach was to shame and punish the drunkard, which rarely addressed the underlying causes of problem drinking and often made things worse. The legacy of medieval substance use extends into our modern world in ways both obvious and subtle. The legacy of medieval substance use extends into our modern world in ways both obvious and subtle. The beer and wine that we drink today are direct descendants of medieval brewing and winemaking traditions. Many of the medicinal plants known to medieval herbalists are still used in modern herbal medicine, and some have been validated by scientific research, while others have been discarded as ineffective or dangerous. The cultural association between alcohol and social gathering, celebration, and relaxation that we take for granted has its roots in medieval tavern culture. Even the ambivalence we feel toward intoxication, the tension between enjoyment and condemnation, between use and abuse, echoes medieval attitudes. The techniques developed by medieval brewers and vintners laid the foundation for modern industries. The careful selection of grains and grapes, the control of fermentation, the aging and storage of finished products, all of these practices have medieval roots. The Belgian Trappist monasteries that still brew beer today continue traditions that stretch back 1,000 years. The wine regions of France, Italy, and Germany were established in the medieval period and still produce some of the world's finest wines. When we drink a Belgian Abbey Ale or a Burgundy wine, we're tasting the legacy of medieval substance production. The scientific understanding that followed the medieval period has dramatically changed how we think about these substances, yet some continuities remain. We still struggle with how to regulate alcohol and other drugs, how to balance individual freedom with social harm, how to address problem use and addiction. We still seek altered consciousness through substances, though our pharmacological options have expanded far beyond what medieval people could have imagined. We still turn to substances for pain relief, for social bonding, for spiritual experiences, for escape from the hardships of life. The specific substances and contexts have changed, but the fundamental human drives remain constant. At the same time, the scientific revolution that followed the medieval period fundamentally changed how we understand these substances. We now know that alcohol is a central nervous system depressant, that opium binds to receptors in the brain, that hallucinogenic plants interfere with neurotransmitter systems. We understand addiction as a complex interaction between chemistry, psychology, and environment. We have developed frameworks for harm reduction, treatment, and regulation that would be incomprehensible to medieval people. We have also created entirely new categories of drugs through chemistry and pharmacology, moving far beyond the natural substances available in medieval times. The development of modern pharmacology owes much to medieval foundations, even as it has transcended them. The careful observation and documentation of plant effects by medieval herbalists provided raw material that later scientists could build upon. The tradition of compounding complex remedies from multiple ingredients anticipated modern pharmaceutical practice. The recognition that substances could be both beneficial and harmful depending on dose and context remains a fundamental principle of modern medicine. Even the moral and ethical debates about substance use that we engage in today have medieval precedents. Yet, for all our scientific progress, some fundamental aspects of the human relationship with mind-altering substances remain unchanged. People still seek escape from suffering, still pursue altered states of consciousness, still use substances socially to bond with others. The desire to transcend ordinary awareness, to ease pain, to celebrate, to mourn, to relax. These are constants of human experience that connect us across the centuries to those medieval farmers, craftsmen, monks, and healers who lived such different lives from ours. The substances may change, the contexts may shift, but the underlying human needs and desires persist. The medieval period also reminds us that the categories we use to organize drugs, legal versus illegal, medicine versus recreation, natural versus synthetic, are not timeless truths but cultural constructs that vary across time and place. What medieval people considered medicine might be classified as a dangerous drug today, and vice versa. What was once a religious sacrament might now be seen as intoxication. These shifting categories reflect changing values, knowledge, and power structures. Understanding this history can help us think more critically about our own assumptions and policies regarding substances. The war on drugs, prohibitionist policies, and the medical marijuana movement of recent decades can all be better understood when we recognize that attitudes toward psychoactive substances have always been complex and contested. Medieval people didn't have a unified, consistent approach to drugs. They had competing values and interests that created tensions and contradictions. The same is true today. By studying how medieval people navigated these tensions, we can gain perspective on our own debates and perhaps find wisdom in their pragmatic, if imperfect, approaches. The harm that came from medieval substance use, the violence, the addiction, the accidental poisonings, the lives destroyed, should not be minimized or romanticized. Medieval people paid real costs for their relationship with intoxicating substances just as we do today. At the same time, the benefits they derived, the pain relief, the social bonding, the moments of joy and transcendence in difficult lives were also real and meaningful. Any honest accounting of medieval substance use must acknowledge both aspects, recognizing the complexity and refusing easy judgments. The persecution of healers and the witch trials stand as particularly dark chapters in this history, reminding us that knowledge of powerful substances has always been politically and socially charged. Those who possessed such knowledge, especially women and members of marginalized groups, were vulnerable to accusations and persecution. The loss of traditional knowledge that resulted from these persecutions impoverished European medicine and culture. This history should make us thoughtful about how we regulate knowledge and practice related to psychoactive substances today, and mindful of who benefits and who suffers from different regulatory approaches. In the end, exploring what getting high was like in medieval times reveals both the strangeness and the familiarity of the past. It was a world where people drank beer for breakfast and considered it safer than water, where monks brewed the finest ales and wines, where healers used plants that could cure or kill with equal ease, where the line between medicine and magic was porous and uncertain. It was a world where suffering was omnipresent and escape was precious, where altered consciousness could be a path to healing or damnation, where communal drinking bound people together in joy and sorrow. It was a world utterly unlike our own in so many ways, yet one in which human beings confronted the same fundamental questions about pleasure, pain, consciousness, and mortality that we still grapple with today. The medieval relationship with intoxicating substances was shaped by necessity, limited by technology, governed by religion, and experienced through community. It lacked the scientific understanding we take for granted, but possessed a rich tapestry of cultural meaning and traditional knowledge. The people of medieval Europe were not naive primitives stumbling through a fog of ignorance, nor were they blessed with some lost wisdom that we've forgotten. They were human beings doing their best to survive, to find moments of pleasure and relief, to make sense of their world, and to pass on what they had learned to the next generation. In their struggles and their solutions, we can see reflections of ourselves, reminders that the human condition transcends the boundaries of time and connects us all in a shared story of seeking, suffering, and survival. As we've journeyed through the taverns and monasteries, the herb gardens and sick rooms, the festivals and rituals of medieval Europe, we've seen a world where getting high was inseparable from getting by, where substances that altered consciousness were woven into the fabric of daily life in ways both profound and mundane. From the morning ale that started the day, to the opium that eased a dying person's final hours, from the wine that became Christ's blood to the suspicious ointments that supposedly let witches fly, these substances shaped medieval experience in countless ways. They were tools of survival, sources of pleasure, instruments of healing, objects of fear, and windows into other realms of experience. Understanding this history enriches our appreciation of the past and helps us think more carefully about our own relationship with substances that alter consciousness, reminding us that we are part of a long human tradition of seeking transcendence, relief, and connection through the chemical alteration of our minds. Thanks for watching this video. Good night.